Welcome to the first episode of Civilians Come First, a podcast about the humanitarian implications of indiscriminate weapons use in armed conflict. My name is Jayne Hackett, and I'm a fourth-year student at the University of Ottawa studying conflict and human rights, and I'll be hosting this discussion today. I'm delighted to introduce our guest for this discussion on humanitarian disarmament policy and advocacy, Gillian Flude, the project officer at Mines Action Canada. Gillian, do you want to start us off by introducing yourself?
Of course. Hi, Jane. Thank you so much for having me on this podcast. I also went to the University of Ottawa and I graduated from the Conflict Studies and Human Rights program 3 years ago. I got involved with Mines Action Canada through their international internship program. Then I started working for Stop Killer Robots on a short-term contract. And since Mines Action Canada is a co-founder of this campaign, I started working for Mines Action Canada once my contract was complete. And I've been working for MAC ever since. What's motivated me to pursue this career is Mines Action Canada's connection to uplifting youth in disarmament. They have various programs to build the capacity for youth, and that really got me interested. And it was motivating to see how many youth around the world are passionate about disarmament.
Thank you so much for joining the podcast today to share your expertise. And I have to say, it's very cool to be interviewing somebody who graduated from my program. It's really interesting to see the potential career opportunities that can come from a degree in conflict and human rights, and particularly related to humanitarian disarmament advocacy and working in a youth advocacy sphere as well. So to start off this discussion, the purpose of today is to fully understand the depth of the impact that indiscriminate weapons, such as landmines and clustering munitions, have on civilian populations during and after armed conflict, and also to analyze the effectiveness of revolutionary international frameworks like the 1997 Ottawa Mine Ban Treaty and the 2008 Clustering Munitions Convention, analyzing these international frameworks at setting a humanitarian-centered precedent within disarmament negotiation and advocacy spaces. So to start us off, I'd like to briefly contextualize this discussion by highlighting the frighteningly lethal and indiscriminate nature of weapons such as landmines and cluster munitions. Gillian, what are the characteristics of these weapons and why are they categorized distinctly as indiscriminate weapons?
So for landmines, there are many different types. For example, there's blast mines, which are the most commonly thought of, and they're buried under the ground. There's butterfly mines that are designed to fall from the sky and not detonate upon landing. There's stake mines, which get stuck in the ground and usually have a tripwire. So these are all examples of different types of landmines, but what make them all landmines is that they are made to explode upon impact of a person coming into contact with it. Cluster munitions are designed to disperse multiple submunitions and can be dropped from an aircraft or launched from a rocket or missile. And they're actually more designed for fields with tanks rolling across it. And warfare isn't really fought like that anymore, meaning that they're more often dropped in urban areas. So cluster munitions are indiscriminate at the time of use because since they disperse hundreds of small submunitions, these cannot be controlled or targeted attacks, and they usually spread out the size of a football field. And then once they land, 5 to 30% of the submunitions fail to explode upon impact, and then they become de facto landmines. And landmines are indiscriminate because they can't tell between the footstep of a soldier or a civilian.
These weapons very clearly have a catastrophic impact upon civilian populations due to their indiscriminate nature. You know, the most recent Landmine Monitor report documenting the 2023 reporting year reported 5,757 casualties globally from landmines and explosive remnants of war. And the corresponding cluster munition monitor of documenting the same 2023 reporting period reported 219 casualties globally from cluster munitions and remnants. Both monitors reported that civilians account for 84% and 93% of these casualties, respectively, when the military or civilian status of the victim was known. This really emphasizes the indiscriminate nature of these weapons and their disproportionate impact upon civilian populations in armed conflict. Who would you say are the civilian populations most at risk, and what are the immediate, long-term, direct and indirect consequences of landmine and cluster munition contamination and exposure for victims, the general population, and the environment?
So civilians living in or around contaminated areas that they need to access for livelihood activities such as farming, getting to school, getting water, and more. So those would be the civilians most at risk. For cluster munitions specifically, children are very at risk, with the latest cluster munition report finding that over 40% of cluster munition casualties were children. Men and boys are more likely to be injured or killed by an explosive remnant, while women are more likely to take on a caregiving role, potentially putting other livelihood activities on hold for this. In terms of countries that are affected, according to the Landmine Monitor, there are 58 states and other areas that are contaminated from landmines. Um, and for cluster munitions, according to the Cluster Munition Monitor, there are 28 states and other areas that are contaminated from cluster munitions. The immediate impacts would be the risk of death or injury from these weapons, but there's many long-term impacts as well. Because of this risk, people or communities have less access to their land for livelihood activities, and this could lead to poverty. Often the world's most contaminated countries are among the world's poorest, for example, Laos, Afghanistan, and Myanmar. For environmental impacts, this mostly lies in the soil because explosions and the chemicals involved can negatively impact the soil, leading to degradation that makes farming more difficult or even impossible.
Yes, absolutely. And the impacts that these weapons have upon civilians and civilian infrastructure are exacerbated even further as contemporary conflicts shift towards densely populated spaces and the lines between civilian and combatant infrastructure are blurred. The international campaign to ban landmines has also documented instances where armed groups and state militaries forcibly use civilians as human shields or quote unquote guides when moving through potential minefields to transfer the risk of accidental detonation onto civilians, as has been the case, for example, with Myanmar's state armed forces using civilians as such. The use of human shields and targeting of civilians and civilian infrastructure are both grave violations of international humanitarian and human rights law, as outlined by the Geneva Conventions, which designate civilians as protected populations in armed conflict. And like you previously mentioned, the impact of these weapons on civilians are long lasting and extend far beyond the duration of the conflict itself. I'd like to shift the discussion now towards the legal and policy implications of this research. In recent decades, recognition of the catastrophic impacts of these weapons upon civilians have begun to affect international law, particularly in disarmament negotiations when we think about the humanitarian impacts of these weapons. The two most prominent examples that I'm thinking of are the 1997 Ottawa Mine Ban Treaty and the 2008 Convention on Cluster Munitions, two international treaties and conventions that seek to prohibit the use, production, and stockpiling of landmines and cluster munitions on the basis of humanitarian reasons, and also provide provisions that regulate the acceptable levels of these weapons which a state can retain for training and research purposes. Both of these international agreements, as evidenced by the regulative and prohibition based components of these treaties, already represent the defense and security aspects of armed policy that are more historically considered in disarmament negotiations. But these international agreements have also spearheaded a shift in the narrative around disarmament negotiations by including revolutionary provisions on the humanitarian aspects of disarmament policy related to civilian protection and victims' assistance. Historically, for a little bit of background, modern disarmament precedent in international humanitarian law extends all the way back to the Geneva Protocol of 1925, which banned the use of asphyxiating gases on the battlefield after its atrocious and minimally effective deployment on the battlefields during World War I. After the catastrophes and targeting of civilians during World War II and conflicts of the Cold War era, using a variety of indiscriminate or injurious weapons, further conventions on the prohibition of biological weapons in 1972 and chemical weapons in 1993 were developed. In 1980, the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons and its subsequently developed Protocols 1 through 5 further prohibited and restricted weapons such as fragmenting weapons undetectable once embedded in the human body, incendiary weapons, blinding lasers, booby traps, explosive remnants of war, and certain types of mines. Of particular importance to this discussion is the Convention's amended Protocol 2, which was amended in 1996 on the regulations of mines, booby traps, and other devices. According to the United Nations Office for Disarmament Affairs, this protocol prohibits the use of non-detectable anti-personnel mines and their transfer, as well as the use of non-self-destructing and non-self-deactivating mines outside of fenced, monitored, and marked areas. Amended Protocol 2 also seeks to limit the indiscriminate damage caused by landmines and requires all contracting parties to take feasible precautions to protect civilians, according to the UNODA. Ultimately, though, this amended Protocol 2 fell short of total prohibition and regulation on the use, stockpiling, transfer, and retention of anti-personnel mines and anti-vehicle mines, which ignited the following Ottawa process to negotiate the 1997 Ottawa Mine Ban Treaty. The 1997 Ottawa Mine Ban Treaty introduced the concepts of victims' assistance and civil society participation as core aspects of humanitarian disarmament. And the 2008 Convention on Cluster Munitions expanded this concept of victims' assistance to be more inclusive and human rights-based, expanding obligations for a states party to the convention to provide rehabilitative care supports for all survivors, no matter the nature of their disability, psychological status, socioeconomic needs, or any other identity or situational-based factor. How did this shift towards prioritizing the humanitarian aspects of disarmament change the landscape of international negotiations, particularly involving the inclusion of non-traditional actors like civil society organizations, Gillian, like your organization Mines Action Canada, or also the involvement of civilians directly affected by landmines and cluster munitions? How did states respond to this, unprecedented and revolutionary inclusion?
Yeah, so survivors and civil society really led the way towards the Mine Ban Treaty. And because the driving force behind states getting together was survivors and civil society, they were also involved in the negotiation room for the treaty. This was something that hadn't really happened before, and I think it was received positively by most states since they were like-minded states coming together because they were all interested in pursuing a mine ban treaty. The Mine Ban Treaty was the first disarmament treaty to reference victim assistance, and it definitely set a precedent for future disarmament treaties. Disarmament treaties that came after the Mine Ban Treaty, such as the Cluster Munition Convention, also involves victim assistance, and negotiation processes involve civil society and survivors. So this really shows that the Mine Ban Treaty did set a precedent for the inclusion of victim assistance and having civil society in the room moving forward.
Despite the groundbreaking support for civilian protections and rehabilitations outlined by these treaties, recent years have demonstrated waning commitment to both the humanitarian and defense arguments favoring disarmament and regulation of indiscriminate weapons. Funding commitments for victims' assistance measures reached a dramatic low, representing only 2% of all global mine action efforts in 2017. In September 2024, Lithuania submitted its notice to withdraw from the Convention on Cluster Munitions within a 6-month timeframe, becoming the first state party to leave any of the 5 multilateral humanitarian disarmament treaties. Recently, Latvian, Estonian, Lithuanian, and Polish ministers of defense released a joint recommendation to withdraw from the Ottawa Treaty banning landmines. These sentiments are contextualized by the heavy use of cluster munitions in the Ukrainian-Russian conflict. But they do represent a worrisome trend towards the disregard of international treaties on humanitarian disarmament. So, Gillian, what are the main challenges in successfully enforcing and implementing the Mine Ban Treaty and Convention on Cluster Munitions? Are there mechanisms to hold states not party to the conventions accountable for the use, production, or stockpiling of these weapons? What are the impacts of lack of accountability upon civilian populations seeking victims' assistance under global mine action efforts?
Thank you. So yes, as you mentioned, the main challenges that we're facing right now are definitely the Eastern European states who are discussing withdrawal from the treaty. This is completely unprecedented. So the main focus of our advocacy here is kind of going back to what we did when the Mine Ban Treaty was being formed over 25 years ago, and focusing on the fact that landmines provide limited military utility as found in a 1996 International Committee of the Red Cross study. Some other challenges with successfully implementing and enforcing the treaties is not enough political will and funding. For example, lack of funding towards victim assistance, as you mentioned, causes minimal services to be available. So this is definitely a major challenge. The main way that states are held accountable is through condemnation of their actions. States don't want to be called out on the international stage, so this can be a very powerful tool. Although the treaty is legally binding because of state sovereignty, it is hard to hold states truly accountable, which is why it's so important for not only civil society, but also other states to speak up against any landmine or cluster munition use, production, transfer, or stockpiling. Creating a strong norm and pushing states to speak up when those norms are broken is the main way that we can hold states accountable. Another example is the Landmine and Cluster Munition Monitor. This is the monitoring and accountability mechanism for the Mine Ban Treaty and the Cluster Munition Convention. And this is completely run and led by civil society and the International Campaign to Ban Landmines and Cluster Munition Coalition. And Mines Action Canada is also very involved with the creation of this monitor.
Okay, and as we've discussed, the impacts of landmines and cluster munitions are not felt equally amongst all civilian populations as a whole. We've seen the geographic, gendered, age, and other considerations that must be accounted for when organizing mine action based off of the most vulnerable at-risk populations, like children, for example, like refugees and internationally displaced persons, rural farmers, and employees in the agricultural community, and anyone really affected by the exacerbations of climate change. So, when approaching humanitarian disarmament from an intersectional perspective, how can the Women, Peace, and Security agenda be applied to the implementation of the Mine Ban Treaty and the Cluster Munition Convention, particularly when it comes to measures that seek to support civilian populations and survivors of these indiscriminate weapons?
Hey, that's a great question because Mines Action Canada has just recently come out with research on how women, peace, and security and mine action are connected. So, various identity factors, including gender, age, and race, influence every aspect of humanitarian mine action, from exposure to the risks, access to services, and influence in the policies. So just one way that women, peace, and security can be applied to the implementation of the Mine Ban Treaty and the Cluster Munition Convention is by building up a gender balanced workforce, which research has shown to really positively impact communities. Mines Action Canada also conducted research from 2019 to 2023, surveying mine action organizations around the world, and we found a 10% increase in women employment, which is a huge step forward for women inclusion in the sector. Recent action plans for both treaties have also included the importance of gender and diversity.
Wow, that 10% increase is absolutely wonderful to hear. And yeah, your recommendations are definitely backed up by, the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research. They partnered with researcher Henry Martinen in 2020 and developed key recommendations towards incorporating gender into mine action specifically. Martinen advocates to ensure that diverse participation, the promotion of women's leadership, and are included in the mine action, and also to ensure that relevant representative organizations like civil society organizations who are dedicated to supporting women affected by mines are present and have a voice at the table. Martin also advocates for ensuring gender sensitive assistance, like you mentioned, making sure that victims assistance services are tailored based off of the needs of those accessing them, and as advocated for in the Convention on Cluster Munitions, those principles of non-discrimination, ensuring that everyone has access to those services, no matter the nature of their disability or any other factors of their identity or living situation. And lastly, Henry Martinen also advocated for the collection of sex and gender disaggregated data, like employment data, for example, which you referenced, to really get to the crux and understand the issues at play in mine action fields, and how can we resolve gender disparities that exist within them. So I guess to close off our discussion today, Gillian, you mentioned in your introduction that one of the reasons you really love working with Mines Action Canada is their youth advocacy, outreach. And so, my question for you would be, what do you recommend are the best ways to get involved in humanitarian disarmament and human rights advocacy, both in Canada and around the world, particularly if you're a young person interested in these international treaties, international law, or human rights in general?
Thank you. That's a great question. So I would suggest reaching out to your local campaign against landmines and cluster munitions. There are hundreds of organizations around the world who are part of the International Campaign to Ban Landmines and Cluster Munition Coalition. So there might be one in your country. You can reach out and ask to be a volunteer, or even if they have any positions open. If there isn't one in your country, you can have a more regional focus and still reach out to an ICBL CMC member that's near you. Another way is that a lot of advocacy involves talking to government officials. So you can reach out to your government representative and let them know that this is an issue that's important to you and ask what their position is on it. And of course, education is also important. So just being aware of the issue and sharing that with others really helps as well.
Okay, thank you so much for those recommendations. And with those advocacy actions in mind, we will bring this first episode of the Civilians Come First podcast to a close. Gillian, thank you so much for joining the conversation today and providing your expertise on humanitarian disarmament and mine action. It was a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you so much for having me and for your interest in disarmament and Mines Action Canada.